From the macabre minds of Laughing Devil Production comes another story from the Nightshade Diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind, amp up your imagination, and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. The Black Island by August Derleth. Being the narrative of Horvath Blayne. That some record of the events leading up to the so-called top-secret experiment conducted at an uncharted South Pacific island on a September day in 1947 ought to be made, I have no question. That it would be wise is a moot point. There are some things against which the human race, which has in any event but a brief moment to remain on this planet, to add to the brief moment of its previous existence, can be only inadequately forewarned and forearmed. And this being so, it is conceivable that it would be better to remain silent and let one's fellow men wait upon events. In final analysis, however, there are judges far better qualified than I, and the progression of events both before and since that experiment has been so disturbing and so suggestive of incredibly ancient evil almost beyond man's grasp, that I am compelled to make this record before time dims these events, if ever it could, or before my own obliteration, which is inevitable and may indeed be nearer than I think. The episode began prosaically enough in the most famous bar in the world, in Singapore. I saw the 5 gentlemen sitting together when first I came into the bar and sat down. I was not far from them, and alone, and I looked at them casually, thinking that someone I knew might be among them. An elderly man with dark glasses and a strangely impressive countenance, and 4 young men in late 20s or early 30s, intent upon some discussion conducted with considerable animation. I recognized no one, so I looked away. I had sat there perhaps 10 minutes, perhaps a little less. Henry Caravel had come up and spoken to me in passing, and we had taken note of the time together. He had just gone when I heard my name spoken. Perhaps Mr. Blayne could enlighten us. The voice was cordial, well modulated, with a peculiar carrying power. Looking up, I saw the 5 gentlemen at their table gazing towards me expectantly. At that instant, the old man stood. "Our discussion is archaeological in a sense, Mr. Blayne," he said directly. "If I may presume, I am Professor Laban Shrewsbury, a fellow American. Will you join us?" I thanked him and, moved by a lively curiosity, went over to his table. He introduced his companions, Andrew Phelan, Abel Keene, Claiborne Boyd, and Nayland Colum, and turned once more to me. "Of course, we all know Horvath Blayne. We have been following with keen interest your papers on Angkor Wat and the Khmer civilization, and with even more interest your studies among the ruins of Ponape. It is no coincidence that we are at the moment discussing the pantheon of Polynesian deities. Tell us, in your opinion, does the Polynesian sea god Tangaroa have the same origin as Neptune?" "Probably Hindu, or Indo-Chinese in origin," I guessed. "Those people are not primarily seafarers," said the professor promptly. "There is a concept older than those civilizations, even if we concede at once that the Polynesian civilization is much younger than those of the Asiatic continent, which gave rise to them. No, we are not interested so much in their relation to other figures in the pantheon as to the conceit which gave them being in the first place, and to its relations to so many frog-like or fish-like figures and motifs which occur and recur in the artwork, ancient and modern, to be found in the South Pacific Islands." I protested that I was not primarily an artist, and certainly could not presume to be a critic of art. The professor brushed this aside with courteous detachment. "But you are familiar with art, and I wonder whether you can explain why the primitives of the South Pacific should emphasize the frog-like or fish-like in their artifacts and arts, while the primitives of the North Pacific, for example, emphasize characteristics which are clearly avian. There are exceptions, of course, you will recognize them. The lizard figures of Easter Island and the frog-like pieces from Melanesia and Micronesia are common to these areas. The avian masks and headdresses of the North Pacific Indian tribes are common to the Canadian coast. But we find on occasion among those coastal Indian tribes disturbingly familiar motifs. Consider, for instance, the markedly frog-like aspects of the shaman's headdress of the Haida tribe common to Prince of Wales Island, and the ceremonial shark headdress of the Tlingit of Ketchikan, Alaska. The totems of the North Pacific Indians are primarily avian in concept, whereas such things as the ancestor figures carved into the tree ferns of the New Hebrides quite clearly suggest aquatic dwellers. I remarked that ancestor worship was common to the Asiatic continent. But this was not his principal thesis, which I recognized in the expectance with which his companions attended to him. He came to it presently. Apropos the sea deities of primitive peoples, had I ever encountered in my archaeological inquiries any of the legends pertaining to the mythological being Cthulhu, whom he regarded as the progenitor of all sea gods, and the lesser deities connected with water as an element. The comment he had made now fell into a distinct and well-knit pattern. Cthulhu, as the ancient god of water, the seas, a water elemental in a sense, must be considered as a primal deity of the South Pacific, while the avian motifs expressed in the artifacts and work of art common to the North Pacific derive from a worship of an air elemental rather than one of the sea. I was indeed familiar with the Cthulhu Mythos, with its remarkable lore, in essence so familiar to the Christian mythos of the expulsion of Sathanas and his followers, and their ever ceaseless attempts to reconquer heaven. The mythos, as I recalled it while listening to the professor speak engagingly of Cthulhu, turned on a conflict between beings known as the elder gods, who presumably inhabited the cosmos many light years away, and lesser beings called the Ancient Ones or the Great Old Ones, who were presumably the motive forces of evil as opposed to those representing good, who were the benevolent elder gods. All had apparently existed in harmony at one time, but then a revolt on the part of the Ancient Ones, who were Cthulhu, master of the waters, Hastur, who roamed the interplanetary spaces before his imprisonment in the dark lake of Hali, Yog-Sothoth, most powerful of the Ancient Ones, Ithaqua, the god of the winds, Sakwa, and Shub-Niggurath, gods of the earth and of fecundity, Nyarlathotep, their dread messenger, and others, resulted in their vanquishment and banishment to various places in the universe, from which they hoped to rise once more against the elder gods, and where they were served by their minions, cults of men and animals reared in their service. They were additionally pertaining to Cthulhu, supposedly inhabiting a secret place on earth. Rather shockingly suggestive legends that certain of his frog-like followers, known as the Deep Ones, had mated with men and produced a horrible travesty of mankind, known to be inhabitants of certain coastal Massachusetts towns. Moreover, the Cthulhu Mythos had sprung from a collection of incredibly old manuscripts and similar sources, purporting to be factual accounts, though nothing was adduced to prove them anything other than fiction of a highly skilled order. These manuscripts and books, the Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdullah Zared, the Cultes des Ghouls, the work of an eccentric French nobleman, the Count Derleth, the Aussprechlichen Kulten of von Junst, a known aberrant who had roamed Europe and Asia in the search of the remnants of old cults, the Solano fragments, the Rillier text, the Gnoptic manuscript, and the like, have been seized upon by writers of contemporary fiction and freely used as a source for incredible tales of fantasy and the macabre, and these had given a kind of aura of authenticity to what, at best, was a collection of lore and legends perhaps unique in the annals of mankind, but surely little more. But you're skeptical, Mr. Blayne, observed the professor. I'm afraid I have the scientific mind, I answered. I rather think all of us here think similarly of ourselves, he said. Am I to understand that you believe in this volume of lore? He gazed at me disconcertingly from behind his dark spectacles. Mr. Blayne, for more than 3 decades, I have been on the trail of Cthulhu. Time after time I have believed that I have closed his avenues of ingress into our time. Time after time I have been misled in thinking so. Then if you believe one aspect of the pantheon, you must believe all the rest, I countered. That is not necessarily so, he replied. But there are wide areas of belief. I have seen, and I know. I too, said Phelan, and his supporting cry was echoed by the others. The truly scientific mind is as hesitant to deprecate as it is to lend support. Let us begin with a primal struggle between the elder gods and the great old ones. I said cautiously, what is the nature of your evidence? The sources are almost infinite. Consider almost all the ancient writings which speak of a great catastrophe which involved the earth. Look to the Old Testament, to the battle of Beth Horon led by Joshua. And he said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand thou still upon Gibeon, and thou, moon, in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stayed. Look to the annals of Cuautitlán, of the lore of the Navajo Indians of Mexico, which speak of an endless night, a tale verified by the Spanish priest Father Bernardino de Sahagún, who, coming to the New World a generation after Columbus, told of the great catastrophe in which the sun rose but a little way over the horizon and then stood still. A catastrophe witnessed by the American Indians. And the Bible again. As they fled from before Israel, the Lord cast down great stones upon them in Azekah, and they died. There are parallel accounts in other ancient manuscripts. The Popol Vuh of the Mayas, the Egyptian papyrus Ipuwer, the Buddhist Visuddhimagga, the Persian Zen-Avesta, the Hindu Vedas, many other. They are curiously coincidental records left in ancient art. The Venus tablets of Babylon, found in the ruins of the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, certain of the Penelopes at Angkor Wat, which you must know, and they are the strangely altered clocks of ancient times. The water clock of the Temple of Ammon at Karnak, now inaccurate for day and night. The shadow clock of Fayum, Egypt, inaccurate too. The astronomical panel in the tomb of Senmut, in which the stars are shown in an order they do not have, but which may presumably have been correct for Senmut's time. And these stars, I submit, are not just accidentally those of the Orion Taurus group, held to be the seat of both the elder gods, who are believed to exist at or near Betelgeuse, and at least one of the ancient ones, Hastur, and were presumably home to all the ancient ones, so that the catastrophe duly recorded in the old documents may very well have been evidence of the titanic battle which was waged between the elder gods and the rebellious ancient ones. I pointed out that there was a current theory concerning erratic conduct on the part of the planet not called Venus. Professor Shrewsbury shrugged this away almost with impatience. Entertaining but pure nonsense. The concept of Venus as a one-time comet can be disproved scientifically. The concept of the conflict between the elder gods and the ancient ones cannot. I submit, Mr. Blayne, that your actual conviction of disbelief is not as strong as your words. In this he was eminently correct. What this strange old man had said had aroused and awakened 1,000 latent memories, all of which now coalesced in the events of the moment. An archaeologist cannot have seen the weird grotesque of Easter Island without a sense of an impending past. He cannot have looked upon Angkor Wat or the shunned ruins of certain of the Marquesa Islands without a dim awareness of the terror that lurked in ancient places. He cannot have studied the legends of ancient peoples without recognizing that the lore of mankind, however exaggerated, takes root in some remote reality. Moreover, there was about my newly found companions an air of gravity which was plain behind their good nature, and was almost sinister without being malevolent. I could not doubt that these gentlemen were deadly serious, for each of them testified mutely that he had been on this quest for more than just a short time. You see, continued Professor Shrewsbury, it would be folly to pretend that this meeting was an accident. Your movements have been studied enough to make it occur. It is just possible that in your studies of ancient ruins, and the drawings, hieroglyphics, and other remains found among them, you may have happened upon something which might afford us a clue to the place we seek. And what is that? I asked. An island. So saying, he unfolded before me a crudely drawn map. I examined the map with interest, which was quickened appreciably when it dawned upon me that this was no ordinary map done by the hand of an ill-informed person, but rather a map drawn by someone who clearly believed in the objects he drew. That these objects were not placed as he had placed them suggested an artist of centuries ago. Java and Borneo, I said, identifying them. These islands are apparently the Carolines, and the marked place is northward, but the directions are not very clear. Yes, that is its drawback, agreed Professor Shrewsbury dryly. I looked at him sharply. Where did you get this, Professor? From a very old man. He must have been very old indeed, I agreed. Almost 15 centuries, he answered without a smile. But come, do you recognize this place beyond the Carolines? I shook my head. Then we fall back upon your own research, Mr. Blayne. You have been in the South Pacific ever since the end of the Second World War. You have gone from island to island, and you have seen certainly that in some areas there is a marked emphasis on the frog-like motif, or the fish-like motif. It matters little, save that we have reason to believe one island at least to be either the focal point or near the focal point of the occurrence of artifacts and works of art stressing the frog. Ponape, I said. He nodded, and the others waited expectantly. You see, he went on, I have been to the Black Island, which has no name and is uncharted because it is not always visible, and rises to the surface only at rare intervals. But my means of travel was somewhat unorthodox. My attempt to blast the island and its horrible ruins was ineffective. We must find it again, and we shall find it most speedily by picking up the trail of that frog-like motif in Polynesian art. There are certain legends, I put in, which speak of a vanishing land. It would presumably be stationary? Yes, making its appearance only when upheavals of the ocean's bed thrust it up, and then evidently not for long. I need not remind you that there have been recent tremors recorded by seismographs for the region of the South Pacific. Conditions are thus ideal for your quest. We are at liberty to suppose it to be part of a larger submerged land area, quite possibly one of the legendary continents. Mu, said Phelan. If Mu existed, countered the professor gravely. There is ample evidence to believe it did, I said, together with Atlantis. If you were to fall back upon your own kind of evidence, there is plenty of legendary to give the belief body. The Bible story of the deluge, for instance. The ancient books' accounts of catastrophes, the submerging of vast land areas, depicted in the drawings found at the sites of so much archaeological discovery. One of the professor's companions grinned and said, You're entering into the spirit of it, Mr. Blayne. The professor, however, gazed at me without smiling. You believe in the existence of Mu, Mr. Blayne? I'm afraid I do. And presumably also in the ancient civilizations said to have inhabited Mu and Atlantis, he went on. There are certain legends attributable to such lost civilizations, Mr. Blayne, particularly in relation to their sea lands of the Carolines. There are survival of ancient worships in the Balearics at Innsmouth, Massachusetts, and then a few other widely separated areas. If Atlantis lay off the coast of Spain, and Mu near the Marshalls, presumably there might have been yet another land area at one time lying off the coast of Massachusetts, and the Black Island might be part of yet another land area. We cannot know. But it is certain that the Bible's deluge and other similar legendary catastrophes might well have been evidence of the titanic struggle which resulted in the banishment of Cthulhu to one of the lost continents of this planet. I nodded, aware for what seemed the first time of the intense scrutiny of the others. The Black Island is thus far the only known avenue directly to Cthulhu. All others are primarily in the possession of the Deep Ones. We must therefore search for it by every means at our disposal. It was at this point of our conversation that I became aware of a subtle force vying with my interest, which was far keener than I had permitted myself to show. It was a blind feeling of hostility, an awareness, as it were, of something malign in the very atmosphere. I looked from one to another of them, but there was nothing in their eyes save only an interest similar to my own. Yet the aura of fear, of enmity, was unmistakable, perhaps made all the more so by its very tenuousness. I looked past my companions, allowing my glance to travel along the bar, among the tables. I saw no one who was even aware of us, though the bar as always was crowded with people of all nationalities and all walks of life. The conviction of hostility, the aura of fear, persisted, lying against my consciousness as were it a tangible thing. I gave my attention again to Professor Shrewsbury. He talked now of the trail of Cthulhu through the arts and crafts of primitive people, and his words conjured up from my own memories 1,000 corroborating details of the curious figures found in the Sepik River Valley of New Guinea, of the tapa cloth designs of the Tonga Islanders, of the hideously suggestive fisherman's god of the Cook Islanders, with its misshapen torso and its substitution of tentacles for legs and arms, of the stone tiki of the Marquesas, markedly frog-like in aspect, of the carvings of the New Zealand Maori, which depict creatures neither man nor octopus, neither fish nor frog, but something of all four, of the revolting war shield design used by Queenslanders, a design of a labyrinth under water, with a tortuously malefic figure at the end of it, tentacles extended, as if for prey, and the similar shell pendants of the Papuans, of the ceremonial music of the Indonesias, particularly the Batak dream music, and the Wayang shadow play of leather puppets on ancient themes dramatizing a legend of sea beings. All these pointed unmistakably to Panape from one direction, while the ceremonial figures used in some parts of the Hawaiian Islands and the great heads of Rano Raraku on Easter Island made a similar indication from the other. Panape, with its shunned ruin, its abandoned port, in which the carvings are of unmistakable significance, carvings of brooding terror, of fishmen, of frogmen, of octopoids, all speaking mutely of a strange and terrible way of life led by inhabitants who are half bestial, half human. And from Panape, where? You are thinking of Panape, said Professor Shrewsbury quietly. Yes, and of what might lie beyond. If the Black Island is not between Panape and Singapore, it must lie between that island and Easter Island. The only direction we have is that of the Johansen narrative, discovered in Lovecraft and subsequently repeated in the story of the disappearance of the HMS Advocate, south latitude 47 degrees, west longitude 127 degrees. That would be in the general area, but the latitude and longitude may not be correct according to the Greenby account. That is the place at which the Advocate ran into a storm blowing something terrible. There is thus a possibility of some error, since we have no way of knowing how far off course the ship may have been blown, nor how long a time elapsed since Greenby last ascertained longitude and latitude. He makes note that they were steering a course straight for the Admiralties or New Guinea, but we saw by the stars that we were off course by west. The Johansen narrative. I interrupted him. Forgive me. I am not familiar with these accounts. My apologies. Of course, you could not be. They are not vital to your knowledge, but exist only as curiously corroborative statements, or rather, as statements which are extremely suggestive in the light of what we know. If one has no belief in Cthulhu and the pantheon of elder gods and ancient ones, such accounts are meaningless and all too readily dismissed as hysteria. If one keeps an open mind, however, such accounts become damnably suggestive. One cannot dismiss them. These accounts apart, and all else too, I said, what do you expect of me? I submit that you are perhaps more qualified to speak with authority on the arts and artifacts of the South Pacific than anyone else within the entire region. We are satisfied that the primitive drawings and sculptures of these people will point unmistakably to the approximate location of the Black Island. Specifically, we are interested in the occurrence of any work similar to the fisherman's god of Cook Island, which we have reason to believe is a representation as seen by the primitive mind, of Cthulhu himself. By narrowing the circle of its incidents, it is logical to suppose that we can box in the site of the island. I nodded thoughtfully, certain that I could almost effortlessly construct the ring that Professor Shrewsbury visualized. Can we count on you, Mr. Blayne? More than that, if you have room for me, I'll join your party. Professor Shrewsbury favored me with a long silent glance, which I found somewhat disconcerting, but at last he said, "We have a place for you, Mr. Blayne. We hope to leave Singapore in 2 days." He gave me his card, writing rapidly on the back of it, "You will find me at this address if you need me." I took my leave of Professor Shrewsbury's party with curious misgivings. My offer to accompany them had been made almost involuntarily. I had had no intention of doing more than the professor had asked, but some impulse stronger than my own wish had impelled me instead to propose that I go with them to seek their goal. Once outside the bar, I asked myself why I had not doubted the professor's strange story. The evidence he had offered was purely circumstantial, and I could not have said that I had in fact ever come upon anything more to justify belief. And yet I found myself behaving and believing readily, not only in the existence of the Black Island, but also in the vast mythology so sketchily outlined for me, in all that pantheon of elder gods and ancient ones, of which that oddly persuasive and yet curiously repellent old man in the black glasses had spoken. Moreover, I recognized that my belief stemmed from something more than Professor Shrewsbury's word. It arose from a deep inner conviction, as if I had known all this long before, but had either refused to acknowledge it or had failed to become aware of it because the proper opportunity for recognition had never arisen. And yet, I had always been strangely stirred at sight of such art as Professor Shrewsbury had hinted at, and most of all at the Cook Islanders' horribly suggestive fisherman's god. What Professor Shrewsbury had plainly intimated was that his work had had a living model, and of this I, despite my archaeological training, had never entertained a shadow of a doubt. I could ask myself how to discover the reasons for my belief in the face of the previous record of dubity I had established in my field. I could not answer, save to point out to an inner conviction far stronger than any amount of cold rationalization. For it cannot be denied that Professor Shrewsbury's analysis was not in itself factual, that the explanation for the various events and the nature of the evidence he projected were alike hypothetical in the extreme, that other solutions presented themselves as well, for the annals of primitive peoples are replete with many weird symbols and customs utterly unrelated to living patterns of contemporary man. But no challenge caused any wavering in my conviction. I knew, as if I had been there, that there was indeed an uncharted island near Panape, that it was part of a sunken kingdom which might indeed have been real yea, and part of mu, that it was the source of an incredible power, and no rationalization could explain either my conviction or my complete refusal to consider any other explanation of the tentative outline Professor Shrewsbury had offered. He too knew the facts he had adduced were but the tiniest fraction of the adducible evidence. And what impulse was it that sent me into the shadows to wait upon the emergence of Professor Shrewsbury and his companions? I could not say, yet I remained in a place of concealment until the 5 men left the bar, watching them come out. I had no impulse to follow, but I knew as by intuition that they would not be unattended, and they were not. Their followers walked at a respectable distance behind them. One, a second, yet another, at widely separated intervals. I stepped out and faced one of them. He met my eyes questioningly for a moment, held my gaze, and looked away. A Lascar. I judged him but oddly deformed, with a curiously suggestive head, foreshortened with little brow, and repellently wide mouth, with scarcely a chin at all, but a sloping fold of skin that vanished into his neck. And his skin, too, was rough, warty. I felt no horror looking at him. Perhaps Professor Shrewsbury's hints had prepared me for such an apparition, for I had known someone would be there. I was equally certain, however, that for the present at least, my newly found friends were in no danger. I took myself off to my quarters presently, very thoughtful and preoccupied, for there was manifestly something more than Professor Shrewsbury's story, and the quest of the 5 for the mythological Cthulhu to stir me. Once at my rooms, I found myself drawn to the packet of papers which had come down to me from my grandfather Waite, for my name had not always been Blayne, having undergone a change in the home of my foster parents in Boston. My grandfather, Asaph Waite, whom I had never consciously seen, and who perished with my grandmother, my father, and my mother in a disaster which had struck their town when I was yet only a babe in arms, and while I was on a visit with cousins in Boston, who had forthwith adopted me after a loss which, to any other older child, would have been shockingly tragic. My grandfather's papers were wrapped in oilskin. He had been a seafaring man out of Massachusetts, at one time an agent of the famous Marsh family, which for generations had been seafaring men, ranging far and wide over the face of the earth, and I had had them with me for years. I had examined the small packet from time to time, with curious stirrings and misgivings. Tonight, something Professor Shrewsbury had said had brought the papers back into my memory, and I wanted to look at them once more, without delay. They consisted of fragments of an old diary. Some pages had been torn out here and there, of fragmentary letters, a few documents, and some of what purported to be my grandfather's own writings, entitled simply Invocations, though down in one corner someone had added, to Dagon. The invocations came to hand first. These were evidently intended as at least semi-poetry, and were written in a manner at times coherent, at others apparently incoherent, unless, as I was now prepared to admit, I lacked the proper key to understanding. I read out by one of them with considerably more care, however, than I had previously given it. By all the depths of Yahanathlai and the dwellers thereof, for the one over all. By the sign of Kish, and all who obey it, for its author. By the door to Yea, and all who use it, who have gone before, and who shall come after, for him to whom it leadeth. By him who is to come, Cthulhu rule Yea. I recognized in the final incomprehensible line 2 of the names Dr. Shrewsbury had said, and I was even more disquieted than ever to discover them here in my possession, even if I had come by them in so casual a fashion. I turned next to the diary, which was evidently judging by notes pertinent to events of the day in the United States for 1928. The entries were not frequent, but it was noteworthy that after a beginning in which my grandfather had chronicled journal fashion comments on the political and historical events of the time, his attention turned ever more and more to something mysterious and personal, to which the diary afforded no key. The entries pertinent to something which troubled my grandfather exceedingly began in late April of that year. April 23rd. Out to D.R. again last night, where saw what M. affirms is him. Amorphous, tentacled, inhuman. Could I have expected other? M. extremely excited. Cannot say that I shared his excitement except that I found myself vacillating between M.'s extreme on the one hand and an equal extremity of aversion on the other. A stormy night. Do not know where all this will lead. April 24. Took note of many boat losses in last night's storm, but none from here, though many were to D.R. So evidently we have been protected for another purpose, which will be made plain in good time. Met M. on the street today. He took no notice of me, as if he did not know who I was. I understand now why he constantly wears the black gloves. If those who do not understand should see. April 27. A stranger in town questioning old Zadok. The word has gone around that Z will have to be dealt with. A pity. He seemed always such a harmless, garrulous old tosspot. Too garrulous, perhaps, but no one has heard him say anything. The stranger, they say, plied him with liquor. There were similar entries and other accounts of many strange journeys to the place given only as D.R., evidently to be reached only by water, the Atlantic, but not far from the settlement, for there was no account of lengthy traveling over water to reach the goal from the town. These entries varied in intensity, but became steadily more and more chaotic. Evidently the town had been seriously disturbed by the prying questions of a strange visitor to that clannish community. By late May he was writing. May 21st. Word passed round that a federal man was asking questions in town today. Visited M.'s refining company. I have not seen him myself, but Obed mentioned seeing him. A short, wiry man, very dark-skinned. A southerner, perhaps. He supposedly comes directly from Washington. M. has cancelled the meeting tonight, and also a trip to D.R. Leopold was to have gone as the S tonight. Now he will be passed over, and the next one will be chosen. May 22nd. The sea very turbulent last night. Anger at D.R. The trip should not have been postponed. May 23rd. Rumors grow. Gilman reported seeing a destroyer in the vicinity of D.R. last evening, but no one else saw it. Gilman entirely too imaginative. Should be disciplined for adding to the growing discontent. May 27. Something wrong. More strangers in town. Also ships off the coast apparently armed. The docks being examined by these tight-lipped outsiders. Are they in reality federal men, or are they others? From H, for instance. How could we know? I have suggested it to M, but he says no, they cannot be. He would feel it if so. M does not appear to be disturbed, but he is not entirely at his ease. Everyone is running to him. June. Z has taken care of right under the noses of the federal men. What can they want? I'm prevailing on J to send the child off to Martha. It was to this period of the diary to which one of the letters belonged. Recognizing it, I had placed the letter to my foster mother between the pages of the diary at this point, and I now opened it and read it once more. June 7th, 1928. Dear Martha, I wrote in considerable haste because we have had to make decisions in a hurry here these past few days. Events have turned up so that it would be best to send Horvath to you for safekeeping. John and Abigail have agreed, however reluctantly, so I sent him with Amos. It might be best to keep Amos with him for a week or two, until he can accustom himself to you and your way of existence there in Boston. Then Amos may come home again, though I do not need him at present. And if you have use for him, by all means retain him until it is convenient for you to send him back to us. Ever affectionately, Asaph Waite. Comparatively few entries remained in the diary, and all were undated, appearing simply under June. They were exceedingly disturbed, betraying what must have been my grandfather's extreme agitation. June. M reports questions very upsetting. Bear directly on DR and the goings-on there. Someone must have talked to the federal men. But who? If M only knew, he would follow Z. There is no room here for traitors, and whoever it will be hunted down and destroyed. And not only him alone, but all who are with him or who support him, including, if he is married, his wife and family. June. Questions about the rights at Dagon Hall. Whoever talks knows. June. Large-scale operation at the docks. A destroyer out at DR. Wild talk of government taking control of situation. June. It is true. Blasting begun and fires have started to spread up from the docks. They will go out of control. Some have taken to the water, but the fire is cutting others off unless they go out of town and around it. Reading these entries again, I found myself more disturbed than ever. The nature of the catastrophe which overtook my progenitors was still not clear. They might have been caught in the fires which followed the inexplicable blasting. They might have become involved in the blastings themselves. Whatever happened, the events which took place in that Massachusetts town had occurred in 1928. In that same year, my parents and my grandparents had been killed in an unnamed catastrophe. It was not unwarranted to presume that these events were connected. The entries in my grandfather's diary actually revealed nothing save that some enterprise with which he was connected, evidently led by the man M, had attracted the attention of federal agents who had invaded the town and taken corrective measures. There was no hint as to the nature of the enterprise, but presumably it was illegal, for nothing was set down in my grandfather's paper to identify it. The remaining letters, there were but two others, were written also in June 1928. One was to my foster parents. Dear Martha and Arvold, I have forwarded by mail out of Arkham a copy of my last will and testament, should anything happen to me, putting you down as executors and administrators of the trust I fund I shall leave to Horvath. Apart from such fees as are set forth for you in the nature of a bequest, I have left all my property to my son and daughter-in-law, but in the event of their deaths to Horvath. I hope I am not too pessimistic, but I do not believe in being inexcusably sanguine. The events of the past few days are not encouraging. As always, Asaph. The second letter was undated, but by its nature it must have been written in June also. It was not an original, as were those to my foster parents, but a copy my grandfather had evidently retained. Dear W., a hasty note to let you know M thinks all is lost for the present. He does not think damage can be done to Yah, but none of us knows. The place swarms with federal men. We think now it is all Zadok's doing. But Z has been taken care of. We do not know who it was he talked to, but have reason to believe it was one of us. He will not escape. Though he was pursued up the tracks out of town and got away, he will be forever haunted by what he has done. Of course you may say, as some have said, it would never have happened if the marshes had kept away from those strange creatures at P. But the South Pacific is a long way from Massachusetts, and who would guess that they would make their way here to the reef? I am afraid now we are all getting what people call the marsh look. It is not attractive. I shall write no more, but I adjure you, if anything happens to us, and that may be, for this thing has so impressed the federal men, that there is no semblance of a trial here for anyone or any place they elect to destroy. Do what you can for my grandson, Horvath Waite, whom you will find in the care of Mr. and Mrs. Arvold W. Blayne in Boston. Asaph. These were the reactions of my grandfather, Waite, attendant upon the catastrophe which struck at his town and at him and his family in that summer of 1928. I had read these papers before, but never with such fascination. Perhaps it was the knowledge of these which lay in memory which accounted for my interest in the project which occupied Professor Shrewsbury. And yet I could not wholly believe that it was, together with a conviction that within the boundaries of Professor Shrewsbury's quest lay the solution to the mystery which had dogged my grandfather, was a haunting memory which loomed forever just on the perimeter of recognition, and it was this, however nameless and faceless, which motivated my deeper and more troubled concern with the trail of Cthulhu, for which I was about to surrender, for the time being at least, all my archaeological research, my hopes and ambition for my future in the field I had chosen for my own. The compulsion was stronger than my wish. I put my grandfather's papers away once more, wrapping them in the oilskin in which they had come to my foster parents, and then, far from tired, I set about to track down, even as Professor Shrewsbury had asked, the occurrence of certain hideously suggestive motifs in the art patterns of the South Pacific Islanders, particularly the fisherman's god of Cook Island. At this I worked steadily for more than 2 hours, consulting not only such references as I owned, but also my own voluminous notes and sketches. At the end of that time I realized that the fisherman's god had made its appearance in one form or another as far to the south as Australia, as far to the north as the Kuriles, and between in Cambodia, Indochina, Siam, and the Malay states. But I had affirmed also, as I had already foreseen, that the incidence of its occurrence was immeasurably greater in the vicinity of Panape. However the circle was drawn, its center would be at or near Panape. That the object of Professor Shrewsbury's quest lay in the immediate vicinity, I had not a shred of doubt. And that something inconceivably malign lay there in that hidden place, I had also no doubt. For it was from Panape that the M of my grandfather Waite's paper had come home, bringing in his aftermath the events which were to culminate in the tragedy of 1928. The reoccurrence of the islands and the legends and corroborative accounts pertinent thereto was not an accident or chance. Ponape was the outpost of mankind's civilization, the outpost nearest the gate into the weird and terrible worlds of the ancient ones, of whom great Cthulhu alone lay forever sleeping, waiting upon the events which would some day rouse him from his centuries-old torpor and send them forth once more upon the unsuspecting peoples of the earth, forth to conquer and bring all the planet under his dominion. We shipped for Panape on the second day, traveling by one of the regular steamers plying the islands. I had thought we were to have possession of a ship of our own, but Professor Shrewsbury offered an explanation that other arrangements had been made out of Panape. We gathered together on the deck soon after leaving the docks, primarily for the purpose of comparing notes, and I discovered that all of them spoke most matter-of-factly of being under surveillance in Singapore. And you, Professor Shrewsbury, turned to me. Were you aware of being followed, Mr. Blayne? I shook my head. But I had thought someone trailed after you, I admitted. Who were they? The deep ones, offered Phelan. They are everywhere, but we've had other followers far more dangerous. The star protects us from them. They cannot harm us as long as we carry it. I have one for you, Mr. Blayne, said Professor Shrewsbury. Who are the deep ones? I asked. Professor Shrewsbury offered me an immediate explanation. The deep ones, he said, were minions of Cthulhu. Originally they had been aquatic only, hideously suggestive of human beings, but essentially frog-like or fish-like. But over a century ago certain American traders had come into the South Pacific and had formed alliances with the deep ones, mating with them and thus producing a hybrid breed which could exist equally well on land or in the sea. It was this hybrid breed which is to be found in most of the port cities of the world, not very far from water. That they were directed by some sort of superintelligence from the sea seemed unquestionable, since they were never long in discovering any member of Professor Shrewsbury's party, all of whom had had previous encounters with the followers of Cthulhu, and indeed with certain minions of others of the Ancient Ones. Their purpose was clearly menacing, but the power of the five-pointed star, which was sealed with the seal of the Elder Gods, rendered them impotent. Should any one of them fail to carry the star, however, he might fall victim to the Deep Ones, or to the abominable Mi-Go, or to the Cho-Cho people, the Shoggoths, the Shantoks, or any among a score or more of those human and semi-human creatures dedicated to the service of the Ancient Ones. Professor Shrewsbury excused himself to go to his cabin and bring me the star of which he had spoken. It was rough surfaced stone, gray in color, with a barely distinguishable seal representing a pillar of light, as closely as I could approximate it. It was not large, it scarcely covered my palm, but it had a most peculiar effect on me, for it felt as if it burned my flesh, and I found it curiously repellent. I put it into my pocket, and there it seemed incredibly heavy. There too it left a burning sensation on my skin, despite the clothing between. It did not appear to have similar effects on the others, as far as I could ascertain. Indeed, it became so heavy presently, and afflicted me so sorely with a sensation of heat, that I found it necessary to excuse myself and hasten to my cabin, so that I could remove the stone from my person and leave it among my possessions. Only then did I feel free to rejoin my companions, where I took a listener's part in their discussion of events beyond my ken, not alone of Cthulhu and Hastur and their minions, or of the others, not alone of the Elder Gods and that titanic battle which must have taken place eons ago and involved countless universes, but of certain adventures these five had shared together, for they made countless references to ancient tablets, to books which, to judge by the dates which occurred in their conversation, had been made long before mankind had learned to write even on papyrus. They spoke repeatedly, too, of a library on Saleno which was beyond my ken. I was loath to ask, but I gathered that they had undergone a period of exile at what must have certainly an archaeologically priceless retreat, a city or library at a place called Saleno, of which I knew nothing and was reluctant to admit ignorance of a site so archaeologically ancient under a name I had hitherto associated only with the stars. Their reference to the Ancient Ones intimated, too, of feuds among these beings, between Hastur and Cthugha on the one hand, and Cthulhu and Ithaqua on the other. Evidently these beings were united only against the Elder Gods, but vied with one another for the worship of their minions, and the destruction or seduction of such inhabitants of their regions as came within their orbits. I gathered, too, that Professor Shrewsbury and his companions had been drawn together, often by mere chance, that all had been exposed to similar dangers, and all had eventually sought the haven which the Professor had discovered many years before. It was somewhat disquieting, too, to reflect upon certain casual references made by the Professor to events in which he had a part, but which had taken place much longer ago than could have been possible, considering his age. But I concluded finally that I must have been in error and misunderstood. That night I had the first of the curiously disturbing dreams which haunted our voyage. Though I slept soundly enough, I was never free of dreams. I dreamed that night that I found myself in a great city deep in the sea. My subaqueous existence did not trouble me. I was able to breathe, move about as I pleased, and carry on a normal existence in the ocean's depth. The city, however, was not a modern city. It was ancient. Quite possibly such a city as might have been visualized by an archaeologist, far more ancient than any I had ever known before, with vast monolithic buildings, on the walls of many of which had been emblazoned representations of the sun, the moon, the stars, and certain grotesquely horrible figments of the artist's imagination, some of them amazingly similar to the fisherman's god of the Cook Islanders. Moreover, some of the buildings featured doorways of an unusual size, both in width and height, as were they constructed for beings beyond the conception of mankind. I moved about among the city streets and lanes unmolested, but I was not alone. Other human or semi-human beings became visible from time to time, most of them strangely frog-like in their aspects and movements, and my own locomotion was rather more frog-like than human. I saw presently that all the inhabitants were moving in one general direction, and I followed in their wake, joining the stream. Thus I came presently to a rise in the sea bottom, at the top of which stood a ruined building which was clearly a temple. The building was of black stone, of pieces suggesting the Egyptian pyramids. It was no longer intact, but had fallen away, disclosing beyond the great doorway a passage which struck downward into the sea bottom. Around the doorway in a semicircle clustered the denizens of that ocean depth, I among them, waiting upon some event which was foreordained. I grew aware of a chanting undulation rising from among them, but I could distinguish no words, for the language was not one I knew. Yet I had the conviction that I should know it, and several of the strange beings near me stared at me in a peculiarly revolting way, accusingly, as if I were guilty of some breach of conduct. But their attention was soon drawn away from me to that ruined doorway. Even while others were still joining the throng from the city below, a kind of glow began to come into being in the doorway, an oddly diffused light, not white or yellow, but green, pale green, lambent, like the movements of the curtain auroras, deepening in intensity as the moments pass. Then deep in the heart of the passage, rising out of the light, came a great amorphous mass of flesh, preceded by incredibly long lashing tentacles, a thing with a head of what might have been a gigantic human being in its upper half, and an octopoid figure below. I caught but a single horrified glimpse of it. Then I screamed aloud and woke. I lay for some time trying to ascertain the reason for being of the dream I had had. Then it grew from my knowledge of the ancient legends. I could not doubt. But how could I account for my perspective in the dream? I was not an interloper. I was in fact on my way to discover the point of egress for Cthulhu. Moreover, I was a witness to something more than was set down in any of the references or sources I had read, and nothing of what I had dreamed had been envisioned in anything Professor Shrewsbury had said. But I puzzled over this problem in vain. The only explanation I could credit lay in the work of a perfervid imagination, which might inconceivably have conjured up the substance of my dream. Lulled by the smooth movement of the ship, I drifted off into sleep once again, and again into dream. This time, however, the setting was far different. I dreamed that I was a spectator at a cataclysmic event far out among the constellations and galaxies. There was a great battle which was joined between beings far beyond the conception of a mere human being. There were great, constantly changing masses of what appeared to be pure light, sometimes in the form of pillars, sometimes as great globes, sometimes as clouds. These masses struggling titanically with other masses, likewise constantly changing not only in intensity and shape but also in color. Their size was monstrous compared to them. I had the size of an ant to a dinosaur. The battle raged in space, and from time to time one of the opponents of the pillars of light would be caught up and flung far outward, dwindling to the sight, and altering hideously in shape, taking on the aspect of a solid fleshy form, yet undergoing unceasing metamorphosis. Suddenly, in the midst of this interstellar engagement, it was as if a curtain had been drawn across the scene. It faded away abruptly, and slowly another took its place, or rather, a succession of scenes, a strange black-watered lake, lost among crags in an utterly alien landscape, certainly not terrestrial, with a boiling, churning disturbance in the middle, and the rising of a thing too hideous to be named. A bleak, dark, wind-swept landscape, with snow-covered crags ringing in a great plateau, in the center of which rose a black structure, suggesting a many-turreted castle, within which sat, enthroned, a quartet of somber beings, in the guise of men, attended by huge bat-winged birds, a sea kingdom, a far cry from Carcassonne, similar to that of which I had previously dreamed, a snowy landscape, suggestive of Canadian regions, with a great shape striding across it, as on the wind, blotting out the stars, showing in their place great shining eyes, a grotesque caricature on mankind in the Arctic wastes. These scenes passed before my eyes in dream with ever-increasing rapidity, and only one was remotely recognizable. A sea-coast town which I was confident was in Massachusetts, or at least somewhere along the New England coast, and there I saw, moving about in its streets, people I remembered having seen far back in memory, particularly the always heavily veiled figure of the woman who had been my mother. The dream ended at last. I woke again, far from sleep now, filled with 1,000 perplexing questions, unable to know the meaning and significance of what I had seen in dream, the kaleidoscope of events utterly beyond my ken. I lay trying to thread them together, to evoke or create a common link, but I could find none save the nebulous mythology of which Professor Shrewsbury had spoken in only the most superficial way. I rose presently and went out on deck. The night was calm, a moon shone, the ship moved steadily through the South Pacific toward our goal. The hour was late, past midnight, and I stood at the rail watching the passing scene, the stars, wondering where, if any place, life such as mankind knew it existed, the sea, with the moonlit glittering and gleaming on the gently swelling water, wondering whether indeed there had ever existed the legendary sunken continents, whether cities had sunk beneath the sea's surface in ages gone by, and what denizens of the deep lurked in those depths as yet unknown to man. Presently, however, the sound of our passage began to have a peculiarly illusory effect, and at the same time I was given to imagining that dark shapes swam with the ship, alongside, shapes in the guise, however distorted, of human beings. It seemed to my already overwrought mind that the very water seemed to whisper my name. Horvath Blayne, Horvath Blayne, over and over, and it was then as if a dozen voices whispered back, Horvath wait, Horvath wait, until at last I was overcome by the conviction that I should turn back, go away, return to my ancestral home, as if I did not know that it had been destroyed in the Holocaust of 1928. So overpoweringly suggestive did this illusion become, that I turned at last and sought the comparative peace of my cabin, where I took once again to my berth, hoping this time for sleep undisturbed by any dream. Then at last I slept. On our arrival at Ponape, our party was met by a grim-visaged American naval official in white uniform, who drew Professor Shrewsbury to one side and spoke briefly with him, while we waited together with a shabby-looking seaman who seemed also to desire some words with the professor. This seaman presently caught the professor's eye. Certainly Professor Shrewsbury did not resent the seaman's familiarity, and within a few moments he was walking at the professor's side, talking animatedly in a dialect I did not clearly understand. The professor listened to him but a short while. Then he halted our party and abruptly altered our immediate plans. Phelan and Blayne, come along with me. The rest of you go to our quarters. Keene, send for Brigadier General Holberg and ask him to see me. Phelan and I therefore accompanied Professor Shrewsbury and his rough companion, who led the way through devious streets and lanes to a building which was assuredly little more than a hovel. Lying on a pallet there, another seaman awaited us. Both men had evidently had foreknowledge of our arrival, for the professor had sent ahead months ago for any lore of a mysterious island which rose on occasion and vanished as strangely. It was manifestly such knowledge as the ailing seaman wished now to impart. His name was Susumu Sereki. He was of Japanese extraction, but clearly of mixed blood, and of more than usual education. He was approaching middle age, but looked older. He had been a hand on a tramp steamer, the Yokohama, out of Hong Kong. The steamer had been wrecked, and he had been one of the men in a lifeboat, Before permitting himself to go further, Professor Shrewsbury now asked us to take careful note of what Sareki said. The account I set down differed in no detail from Phelan's. We made no attempt, of course, to reproduce the exact language of the ailing man. Of course, was for Panape. Bailey had a compass, and so we knew about where we were going. The first night after the storm, we were moving along all right. Henderson and Melick were at the oars with Spolito and Yohira. It was clear we had enough food and water, nobody dreaming anything. I mean, we saw something in the water. We thought it was sharks or porpoises, maybe marlins. We couldn't see well enough. It was dark, and they stayed away from the boat, just followed us and went along with us. Along about my watch, they came closer. They had a funny look, like they had arms and legs instead of fins and a tail, but they were up and down so much you couldn't be sure. Then, quicker than a cat, something reached over into the boat and got Spolito. Just pulled him out. He screamed and Melick reached out for him, but he was gone before Melick could go to him. Melick said he saw something like a webbed hand. He was near crazy with fear afterward. Spolito just went down and never came up again. All our followers were gone, quick. Then they came back an hour later, and that time they got Yohira the same way. After that, nothing more, and when morning came we saw the island. It was an island where none was before. There was nothing growing on it, and it was black with muck, I think, but there were remains of buildings on it, buildings like I never saw before, with big odd-shaped blocks of stone. There was an open door, very large, partly broken away. Henderson had the glasses and he got a good look. Then he passed them around. Henderson wanted to go to the place, but I didn't. Well, he talked, and Mason, Melick, and Gunders decided to go ashore. Benton and I held back, and the way we settled it was we rowed over, and Benton and I stayed in the boat with the glasses to watch the others. They got out and sloshed through the muck and seaweed to the stones, and then they went on to that doorway. All four of them were there, and I was looking at them through the glasses. I don't know how it happened, but something big and black just puffed out of the doorway and fell on the four of them. It pulled back with a horrible sucking noise, but Henderson and Mason and the others were gone. Benton had seen it too, but not as clear. I didn't go to look. I didn't want to see any more. We rowed as fast as we could and got away from there. We never stopped rowing until the freighter Rhineland picked us up. Did you set down the latitude and longitude of the island? Asked Professor Shrewsbury. No, but we lost a ship at about south latitude 49 degrees, west longitude 128 degrees. It is towards Panape from there, but not close to Panape. You saw this thing in the morning by daylight? Yes, but there were fogs, green fogs. It was not clear. How far out of Panape? Perhaps a day? Professor Shrewsbury succeeded in establishing no more. Nevertheless, he appeared pleased. He paused only long enough to ascertain that Sareki would recover from the shock and exhaustion which gripped him. Then he returned to the quarters he had arranged for us. There we found Brigadier General Holberg, a grim, gray-haired man of approximately 60, waiting for us. Immediately after introductions had been exchanged, he came to the subject of his presence and his reason for it. I have been told to place myself at your disposal, Professor Shrewsbury, by an authority I cannot very well disregard. He smiled frostily. Operation Panop is apparently your personal project, sir. You have been given some of the documents to read, surely? I have read the documents, yes. I have no comment to make. This is your field, not mine. I have a destroyer ready for your use as soon as you wish. If you would like to come aboard, it will be ready to set sail. A carrier is within call and the weapon is in readiness, subject to my order. I understand you will attempt destruction with other weapons first? That is the plan, yes. When do you expect to leave Panapa, sir? Within a week, General. Very good. We shall be at your disposal. The events of that week on Panape were essentially trivial, concerning primarily the amassing of powerful explosive weapons for use on the Black Island, if indeed we could find that uncharted land area. But behind these superficial tasks loomed something profoundly disturbing. It was not alone the undeniable fact that we were under surveillance. We had come to expect that. It was not only that we were constantly aware of an impending task of singular magnitude. This too was to be expected. No, it was something more. It was the consciousness of the proximity of a vast and primeval power, which gave off a malignance almost tangible. All of us felt this. I alone felt something more. Yet, I could not define the intangible fear under which I labored. It was far more than fear of the evil that lurked in the sea off Panape. It was something that reached to the very wellsprings of my being. Something integral in my essential self. Something that was omnipresent like a pulsing undercurrent in my very blood and bone. Try as I might, I could not rid myself of it. I regretted 1,000 times having yielded to Professor Shrewsbury's invitation that evening in Singapore, which already seemed incredibly far away. This cloud hung over me without alleviation day after day, until the day of our departure from Panape. That day dawned sultry and hot, and for me filled with foreboding. We set out early on the destroyer Hamilton with General Holberg aboard. Professor Shrewsbury had worked out a course. He had had further discussions with the seaman Serecki, and he had arrived at an approximate location. Nor, I gathered, had the general been idle. Aeroplanes had been scouting the sea in the vicinity of the place where the Yokohama had gone down, and one pilot had reported seeing a curiously fog-shrouded area in the sea. No land had been visible, but the occurrence of an unmoving mass of fog was in itself strange enough to command attention. The latitude and longitude had been sent in, and it was for this spot that the Hamiltons set out. Despite my forebodings, however, our journey was singularly uneventful. The clouds which had obscured the sun at dawn drew away by midday. The sultriness too vanished and gave way to a clear, less humid atmosphere. An air of excitement prevailed, a kind of tension which we all shared except for the general, whose manner was that of a military man obeying an order without quite believing in its necessity. He and the professor held some colloquy on the destructiveness of modern warfare, and what Professor Shrewsbury wanted to know was likely to happen to so small a land area as the Black Island. "Wiped out," said the general laconically. "I wonder," answered the professor. "We shall see." I do not know whether I actually expected the destroyer to reach the Black Island. Certainly I did not share the general's calm confidence. But in late afternoon of that day, we sighted an uncharted island, and within a short time we were lowering a boat containing Professor Shrewsbury, Phelan, Keene, and myself. A second boat carried paraphernalia together with Boyd and Column, and 2 men from the destroyer. Significantly, the ship's guns were trained on the structure just visible on the island. It did not surprise me to find the Black Island to be the temple peak of my dream. Here it was, exactly as I had seen it, with the carven door open and the mouth of that great portal yawning to the sun, despite an aura of mist which lay greenly over everything. The ruins were breathtaking, though plainly ravaged by quakes and quite clearly by explosives, whose ineffectual damage differed from that greater damage of earthquake, which had burst asunder many of the angles of the colossal stone building. The stones, like the soil, were black and forbidding, and their surfaces were covered with terrible hieroglyphs and shocking images. The building was composed of angles and planes which were non-Euclidean, hinting horribly of alien dimensions and spheres, as had this building and what remained of the sunken city beyond it had been constructed by non-terrestrials. Professor Shrewsbury cautioned us before we landed. "I believe Serecki's story to be substantially true," he said, "and I have no hope that this attack will seal the opening or destroy its guardians. We must therefore be prepared to flee at the slightest suggestion that something is rising from below. We need not fear anything other than what might appear. The stones will protect us from them. But if he who waits dreaming below rises, we dare not linger. Let us therefore lose no time in minding the portal. The surface of the island was cloying. The muck had not yet been exposed sufficiently to the sun to be dried. Moreover, the pale green mists which continued to hang about the island were humid and faintly malodorous, not alone of the exposed surfaces of something long under water, but of something more, an animal-like smell which was neither a musk nor a pungency, but a cloying, almost charnel smell. The atmosphere of the island differed sharply from that of the surrounding sea. Perhaps it was the cloying smell, perhaps the humidity, perhaps the exhalation of the ancient stones. And above all hung an aura of dread, all the more inexplicable for the still brightly shining sun, and the protective presence of the Hamilton lying not far offshore. We worked rapidly, nevertheless none of us could escape the growing sense of malevolence which was manifest. The aura of dread which clung to the island heightened steadily, apprehension of some impending horror increased. There was a mounting tension among us, despite the fact that Professor Shrewsbury maintained a ceaseless vigilance at the very threshold of the yawning cavern, ingress to which was afforded by the broken doorway. It was plain to see that he expected danger from this source, if no other, though the very waters around the island were fraught with peril, if Sir Recky's story were uncolored by his imagination. At the same time, I was agonizingly aware of inimical forces which seemed almost personal. I felt them physically, quite apart from the chaotic confusion of my thoughts. In truth, the island affected me profoundly, and its effect was cumulative, not only fear, but a deep depression of my spirits, not only apprehension, but a basic disorder of such a nature as to stir up within me a conflict, of the significance of which I was not cognizant, but a conflict which was alarmingly disorganizing, so that I found myself at one and the same time eager to help and anxious to impede or destroy the work being done by my companions. It was almost with relief that I heard the professor's abrupt cry, "He is coming!" I looked up. There was a faint green luminosity showing far down the well of dark within the portal. Just a luminosity, as I had seen in my dream. I knew, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that what would emerge from that maw would be akin to the being seen in my dream. Also a terrifyingly horrible caricature of an octopoid creature with a grotesquely gigantic half-head of a human being. And for one instant I was moved, not to follow the others who were already on their way down to the boats, carrying the detonator for the explosives which had been laid all about the portal, but to hurl myself down into that pit of darkness, down the monolithic steps, to that nether place in accursed Relier where great Cthulhu lay dreaming, waiting his time to rise once more and seize the waters and the lands of earth. The moment broke. I turned at Professor Shrewsbury's sharp call and followed, with the malevolence of that charnel place rising behind me like a cloud, and with the horrible conviction that I was marked as the especial victim of that ghastly being making its way out of the depths below that eldritch temple. I was the last of them to reach the boats, and at once we pushed off for the destroyer. It was still light, though the day was now far gone. The sun had not yet gone down, so that what took place on that awe-inspiring island was plainly visible to all of us. There we waited upon Professor Shrewsbury's order to detonate the explosives, and we were accordingly given the opportunity to see the emergence of the ghastly being from the depths. The first movement was of tentacles, which came oozing forth from the opening, slithering over the great rocks, accompanied by a horrible sloshing, sucking sound, as of great footsteps in the bowels of earth. Then abruptly there loomed within the portal, preceded by an emanation of green light, a thing which was little more than a protoplasmic mass, from the body of which 1,000 tentacles of every length and thickness flailed forth, from the head of which, constantly altering in shape From an amorphous bulge to a simulacrum of a man's head, a single malevolent eye peered. A shocking sound, as of retching, accompanied by undulations and a fluted whistling, came to us across the water. I closed my eyes. I could not bear to see in reality the horror I had seen in dreams so short a time ago. At that instant, Professor Shrewsbury gave the signal. The explosives burst with a tremendous concussion. What had survived that earlier explosion, including now the portal itself, burst upward and outward. The thing in the doorway, too, was torn apart, and in a few moments portions of the stone blocks fell upon it, further shattering it. But chillingly, when the sound of the explosion had died away, there came to our ears still, without change, the undulations and the whistling and the retching sounds we had heard. And there, before our eyes, the shattered mass of the thing from the depth was flowing together like water, reforming, shaping itself anew once more. Professor Shrewsbury's face was grim, but he did not hesitate. He ordered the boats returned to the destroyer at once. What we had seen lent strength and purpose to our arms, and we reached the Hamilton within a very short time. General Holberg, glasses in hand, faced us on the top deck. "A shocking thing, Professor Shrewsbury. Must it be the weapon?" Professor Shrewsbury nodded silently. General Holberg raised one left aloft. "Now let us watch," he said. The thing on the island was still growing. It towered now above the ruins, expanding into the heavens, beginning to flow down to the water's edge. "Horrible, horrible," murmured General Holberg. "What in God's name is it?" "Perhaps something from an alien dimension," replied the professor wearily. "No one knows. It may be that even the weapon is powerless against it." "Nothing can resist that, sir." "The military mind," murmured the professor. The Hamilton was moving away, gathering speed. "How long will it take, General?" "The carrier will have had our signal by this time. The plane was loaded. It should not take longer than it takes us to reach the limit of safety." On the island, a great black mass stood out against the setting sun, diminishing now only because we were moving so rapidly away from it. Presently the island itself was lost, and only the suggestive black mass remained, dark upon the heavens. Overhead roared an aeroplane, making for the island. "There it goes!" cried General Holberg. "Please look away. Even at this distance the light will be blinding." We turned obediently. In a few moments the sound came shockingly. In another few seconds the force of the explosion struck us like a physical blow. It seemed a long time before the general spoke again. "Look now, if you like." We turned. Over the place where the black island had been loomed now a gigantic cloud, mushrooming and billowing skyward. A cloud greater than the size of the island itself, of white and gray and tan colors, beautiful in itself to see. And I knew what the weapon had been, remembering Hiroshima and the Bikini experiment. I knew what a titanic force had fallen upon that hideously menacing island, risen from the Pacific for the last time, only to be blown asunder with all that it contained forever. "I rather think it cannot have survived that," said General Holberg calmly. "I pray heaven you are right," said Professor Shrewsbury firmly. I remember now, after all these months, how sober and grave Professor Shrewsbury was at our parting. I remember how he said something in sympathy, and I did not then understand it. But since then I have come to know that somehow, despite the fact that behind those black glasses he always wore, that strange and wise man had no eyes with which to see, and yet saw. He saw more than I myself knew about myself. I think of this now often. We parted where we had met at Singapore. From Singapore I went back to Cambodia, then to Calcutta, then to Tibet, and back to the coast, from which I took ship for America, driven now by more than curiosity about archaeology, by an insistence upon knowing more of myself, of my father and mother, of my grandparents. We parted as friends, united by a common bond. Professor Shrewsbury's words had been hopeful. yet faintly prophetic. Perhaps he had said he had died in the atomic blast, but we must recognize he had insisted that something from an alien dimension, something from another planet, might not be subject to our natural laws. One could only hope. His work was either done or had gone as far as it could go. Short of ceaseless vigilance to stop up temporarily every avenue to the open that might be attempted by Cthulhu or those who followed him, who worshipped him and did the bidding of the Ancient Ones. Because I alone of the six of us had no doubt, not of the death and disintegration of the thing on the Black Island, but of its survival. I knew by an intuition, I could not then explain, that Rillier still stood in its depths, wounded but not destroyed, that the dweller in those subaqueous depths still existed in whatever form he chose to assume, that his worshippers still bowed in submission to him from every sea and port in the world. I went home to find out why I had had what I recognized as a feeling of kinship for the Deep Ones, for the thing that lived in the sunken realm of Rillier, for Cthulhu, of whom it was once said, and is still said, and will be said until the coming again, Cthulhu Rillier. I went home to Massachusetts to discover why my mother went veiled for most of her life, to learn what it meant to be one of the Waits of Innsmouth, destroyed by the Federals in 1928 to wipe out the accursed plague which had come upon the inhabitants, including the Waits, who were my grandparents and my parents. For their blood flows in my veins, the blood of the Deep Ones, the spawn of the black mating in the South Pacific. And I know that I have earned their special hatred as a traitor to that blood, for even now I feel the longing to descend into the depths, to make my way to the glory of Yanathle, where it lies in the Atlantic off Devil Reef, beyond Innsmouth, to the splendor of Aurelier in the waters near Panape. And even now I know the fear of going to them, with a taste of treachery in my mouth. At night I hear them calling, Horvath, wait! Horvath, wait! And I know how long it will be before they seek me out and find me. For it was vain to hope, as Professor Shrewsbury did, that Cthulhu could have been vanquished so easily. The battle of the Elder God had been far greater, far more titanic than even that impressive bomb which had erased the Black Island from the face of the Pacific that memorable day. And that interstellar battle had lasted long before victory was won by the Elder Gods, who were all-powerful, who were great above all others, and banished the Ancient Ones to outer darkness forever. For weeks after my shocking discovery, I asked myself which one of us would be the first to be discovered. I asked myself how it would be brought about. Certainly by no crude means, no alarming crime, which might startle into renewed activity Professor Shrewsbury and Andrew Phelan and the others. And today the papers brought me the answer. Gloucester, Massachusetts. The Reverend Abel Keene, a newly ordained clergyman, was drowned today while swimming near Gloucester. He had been accounted an excellent swimmer, but went down within sight of many other bathers. His body has not yet been recovered. Now I ask myself, who will be next? And how long will it be in the endless progression of days before those who serve him will summon me to atonement in those black depths where great Cthulhu lies dreaming, waiting upon his time to rise again and take possession of the lands and the seas and all that lives within them, once more as before, once more and forever.